Today we're going to review lessons 8.5 through 8.8. This is going to be the second half of the Chapter 8 test that is coming up very soon. So we're going to go through some of these examples together. You're going to do a couple on your own, but make sure you're taking notes and putting your answers into the Schoology assignment. So here is a problem from lesson 8.5 and 8.7. The directions say to factor completely. Remember, first and foremost, when asked to factor completely, look for a GCF. Notice how there is a 1, in front of the x squared and a 1 in front of the x. The moment I have the number 1, I know that the biggest number that I'm going to be able to take out for a GCF is 1. That's not going to change any of my numbers, so there are no numbers in common. If I look at the last number, notice how there are no variables. So I checked, but not every single term has the same variable or the same number, so there is no GCF. And when there is no GCF and there's a 1 in front of the x squared, our thought process should be what is multiplying to the last number, but adding to the number in the middle. Notice that the last number is not just 30, it is negative 30. So we want to create a table to figure out what are some numbers that multiply to negative 30. Because it has to multiply to a negative, one of our numbers has to be positive, one of our numbers has to be negative. I want to have them add up to the number 1. So we want numbers that are really close to each other. So if you use your factor multiplication chart, you should hopefully see that 6 and 5 multiply to 30. So let's make the 6 positive and the 5 negative. That will multiply to negative 30. Notice that when I add these two numbers together, 6 plus negative 5 is going to get me the positive 1 that I'm looking for. So those are the numbers that are going to go in part of my final answer. So the question is, how do I write my answer? Well, remember, factor means that we have multiplication for our final answer. So I want two parentheses being multiplied together. Because it's x squared to start with, that means we want each of our parentheses to start with an x. We'll want one of the numbers after the x to be a positive 6 and one of them to be a negative 5. This would be my answer. Once again, you can always go and double check by multiplying that back out by using either the box method or the distributive method and seeing that you got the original problem. So there's always a way to double check if you did it correctly. Okay, let's factor this one completely. We've got x squared minus 16. Notice that we have to look for a GCF first. There's technically a 1 with the x squared. So once again, when there's a 1, you're not going to be able to take out any numbers. The 16 doesn't have any variables. So that means there are no GCFs between those two terms. So because there's only two terms here, there's a couple of ways that you can think about this. This is a difference of two squares because technically 16 is a perfect square. If you look at your multiplication table, you'll see that 16 is highlighted in yellow on that diagonal. Those are all perfect square numbers. So you can go about that way to factor. The other way to think about this is to throw in that middle term of x with a 0, because then that way you can ask yourself, what is going to multiply to the last number but add to the number in the middle? And so because it needs to multiply to a negative, I know one number is negative and one number is positive. To make it add to 0 means they have to be the same number. So 4 and negative 4 multiply to negative 16. When I add those two numbers, I will get the 0 that I'm looking for. So that means that my answer has to be two things multiplied together. Because x squared starts us off, we'll have an x and an x for each of our parentheses. One of the parentheses will have a positive 4, and one of them will have a negative 4. Remember, the numbers could be switched around, but you have to make sure that you have the signs correct. right, let's factor completely. We have got 3x squared minus 27x plus 42. We got to look for a GCF first. If I look at my numbers, 3 is the smallest number. So my question is, can I multiply 3 times something to get 27? The answer is yes. 3 times 9 is 27. So far, there's 3's in common. So now let's check. Can I multiply 3 times something to get 42? So once again, if you're using your multiplication table, you should be able to see that 3 times 14 is 42. So all of these have a 3 in common. So I know that I will have a 3 on the outside. They don't all have variables. So I know that my GCF is just that number 3. And now I'm going to write the trinomial that's left over once the 3 got taken out. So in the first term, ignore the 3. We just have the x squared. I'm going to bring down that subtraction sign. Ignore the 27 because that's 3 times 9. Well, we just took out the 3, so that means we're left with the 9. There's still an x with that middle term. I'm going to bring down that addition sign. You can ignore 42 because that's 3 times 14, but we get to ignore the 3 because we took that out as the GCF. So that means 14 is the number that's left over. And now because I have parentheses with a 1 in front of the x squared, just like the last couple of problems, we're asking what multiplies to the last number but adds to the number in the middle. So if I want to multiply to a positive number but add to a negative number, I am going to want both of my numbers to be negative because a negative times a negative is a positive. So what multiplies to 14? 2 and 7. So notice that negative 2 times negative 7 will also get me positive 14. If I add those two negative numbers, I'm going to get the negative 9 that I'm looking for. My final answer has to have that GCF. So I bring down the 3, and now I can write my 2 parentheses. I get to start each of my parentheses with an x because we just had a 1 in front of the x squared. I want a negative 2 for one of the parentheses and a negative 7 for the other. And this would be my final completely factored answer. Okay, so you guys try this one on your own. Pause the video, try it. All right, moving on to lesson 8.6. Once again, we're asked to factor completely. First step is to look for a GCF. So I think 3 is the smallest number between all of these numbers. But if I start trying to break them down, I can't find 3 times a number to get me 20. I can't find 3 times a number to get me 7. So unfortunately, I don't have a number in common. 7 doesn't have a variable, so there is no GCF. So the problem is there's a number in front of the x squared. So I have to start with that number. We have to ask ourselves what multiplies to that number. That would be 3 times 1, which means we're going to do a guess and check process where I'm going to have the 3 with one of the x's to start me off and the 1 with the x in the second parenthesis. If I look at the last number, I want to find numbers that multiply to 7. Well, that's 1 times 7. Notice that there is a negative sign in front, so we're going to have to make one of those numbers negative. So it's either negative 1 times 7 or 1 times negative 7. So now this is where the guessing comes into play. I need to put one of these 2 options into the second half of my parentheses. So I'm going to guess, I'm going to start with the bottom one right here. So 1 and negative 7. And I'm going to put it in just like it is. Positive 1 I'll put first and negative 7 I'll put second. So I did my guessing and now I want to do my checking. So to check, I'm going to multiply the outer terms together. So the 3x is going to get multiplied by the negative 7. That gives me negative 21x. Then I have to multiply the inside numbers together. 1 times x is 1x. If I add these like terms, I am hoping to get this middle term of negative 20x. Well, notice that 1x minus 21x will get me the negative 20x that I'm looking for, which tells me that we guessed correctly. So this is my final answer. Had I not gotten negative 20 in the middle, then I would have had to reverse the numbers or change the signs to try to get to that negative 20. Okay. So you try this one on your own. Pause the video, factor completely. All right, last lesson was 8.8. So once again, factor completely. First thing I want to do is look for a GCF. I noticed that there is a 1 with that second term. So right off the bat, if there's a 1, I'm not going to have a number in common besides 1. If I look at all of my terms, that 11 doesn't have a variable. So there is no GCF between all 4. So because there are 4 terms, this is where we have to factor by grouping. I'm going to group the first 2 terms in parentheses. Then I need an addition sign to break up my second group. So notice that because it was a negative, I get to keep that with the 22. All right, so now I'm going to take each parenthesis and factor out a GCF. So if I look at the first parenthesis, I notice that the only thing they're going to have in common is variables. Once again, if you want, you could put a 1 there. Notice that they have x's in common, and we take the smaller exponent. 2 is smaller than 3, so x squared, we get to move to the outside, which means there's still going to be a 2 on the inside. If I started with 3 x's, but I took 2 of them out, I'm left with 1x. I'm going to bring down that subtraction sign. Notice that if I'm taking out the variables, I'm still left with the 1. So remember, 2x minus 1 is what I want to turn that second parenthesis into. So that means I want this negative 22x to really be with a 2. So 2 times what is negative 22? That would be negative 11. I need to get that 11 to be a negative 1. Well, negative 1 times what is positive 11? And that would be negative 11. Notice that they both have a negative 11 in common. That's what I get to put on the outside. In parentheses then, I'd still have the 2 and the x, and then I'd have a negative 1. So the fact that now both of those contain a 2x minus 1, I get to write my final answer as 2 things multiplied together. One of those 2 parentheses is what they both had, which was the 2x minus 1. And then the GCFs that we took out, so the x squared minus 11, finishes the rest of that problem. And this is my factored answer. So pause the video and try this one on your own. And that is going to finish us off. Good luck with the putting it into school.